Sometimes the moment that breaks your heart is the same moment that quietly begins your freedom. Naomi Carter did not expect the night to feel so cold. New York in late October usually carried a crisp elegance, the kind that made the city lights shimmer like gold across the glass towers of Manhattan. But tonight the air felt different, heavier somehow, as if the world itself had paused to watch something important unfold. Naomi stood outside the entrance of the Grand Astoria Hotel, her fingers trembling slightly around the cream-colored envelope she had opened only minutes earlier. The invitation paper was thick and expensive, the kind only people with unimaginable wealth bothered to use, and the gold lettering across the front seemed to glow under the streetlights. Ethan Whitmore and Victoria Langford request the honor of your presence at their wedding celebration. For a moment, Naomi simply stared at the words as if they belonged to someone else's life. Just 3 months ago, she had been standing in the kitchen of the penthouse Ethan once shared with her, laughing softly while he brewed coffee and told her about a new international project that might take him overseas for a few weeks. Just 3 months ago, he had kissed her forehead and promised they would take a vacation together once his schedule calmed down. Just 3 months ago, Naomi Carter had believed she was the luckiest woman in New York. A taxi rushed past on Fifth Avenue, splashing rainwater across the curb and snapping her back into the present. The city moved on like it always did, uncaring, relentless, full of people chasing dreams under the glow of neon and ambition. Naomi slowly placed her free hand over her stomach, a gesture that had become instinctive even though the life growing inside her was still too small to feel. 8 weeks. That was what the doctor had told her earlier that afternoon. 8 weeks pregnant. The news had filled her with a quiet joy she had planned to share with Ethan that very night. She had imagined the surprise in his eyes, the way his serious expression would soften when he realized he was going to be a father. She had even rehearsed the moment in her mind while walking through Central Park after the appointment. Instead, the only surprise waiting for her was a wedding invitation announcing that the man she loved was marrying someone else. Naomi exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost beneath the distant hum of traffic and the murmur of late-night pedestrians. Across the street, a massive digital billboard flickered to life, casting pale light across the polished glass entrance of the hotel. In that reflection, she caught a glimpse of herself, dark curls framing a calm but unreadable face, eyes steady, though the world beneath them had shifted in ways she was only beginning to understand. She remembered the first time she had met Ethan Whitmore 2 years earlier at a charity architecture gala in Midtown. He had been surrounded by investors and journalists, the youngest billionaire in the room and the most intimidating presence she had ever encountered. Yet when he spoke to her, there had been something different in his voice, something warmer, something that made her believe she had stepped into a future brighter than anything she had ever imagined. Now that future existed only on a sheet of paper held tightly between her fingers. Inside the Grand Astoria ballroom, crystal chandeliers sparkled above a room being prepared for one of the most extravagant weddings the city would see that year. Naomi could almost picture it. The orchestra, the champagne, the applause when Ethan Whitmore kissed his bride. But what no one inside that ballroom knew was that somewhere beyond those golden doors stood the woman he had once promised forever, and within her lived the secret that would change far more than a wedding night. Naomi folded the invitation carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. The wind brushed softly against her coat as she turned away from the hotel and began walking down the glowing Manhattan street, unaware that the quiet decision she made in that moment would one day transform heartbreak into a life no one, including Ethan Whitmore, could ever take back. The wind followed Naomi Carter for 2 blocks before she realized she was still holding her breath. Manhattan at night usually felt alive in a way that made people believe anything was possible. But tonight, every passing car and every glowing storefront felt strangely distant, like she was walking through a city that no longer belonged to her. She slowed near the corner of Madison Avenue and 42nd Street, the yellow lights of a small cafe spilling onto the sidewalk. The warmth inside contrasted sharply with the chill outside, and for a moment she considered stepping in just to sit somewhere quiet. Instead, she stood still, her fingers brushing once again against her stomach as if confirming the fragile truth she carried with her. 8 weeks. The doctor's voice echoed clearly in her memory. Healthy, strong heartbeat. Naomi had left the clinic earlier that afternoon with a smile she could not hide, already imagining how Ethan would react when she told him. She had even walked through a baby boutique on Lexington Avenue afterward, pausing at a display of tiny shoes no longer than the width of her palm. The thought of a child had felt like the natural next chapter of the life she believed they were building together. Now the memory felt like a photograph from another lifetime. A bus rumbled past, its windows glowing softly, and Naomi watched the reflection of the city slide across the glass storefront beside her. For a moment she allowed herself to remember the beginning, back when everything with Ethan Whitmore had seemed almost unreal. Their first conversation had lasted nearly 2 hours at that charity gala, even though they had both pretended it would only be a few minutes. He had asked thoughtful questions about her design work, about the spaces she believed people deserved to live in, and he had listened in a way few people ever did. Later he had admitted that her confidence had surprised him. Most people treated him like a headline or a bank account, but Naomi had spoken to him like he was simply another person standing beneath the same chandeliers. Those early months had been full of quiet mornings and long conversations, of walking through Central Park with coffee cups warming their hands while the city slowly woke around them. Ethan had once told her that meeting her had been the first time success felt meaningful instead of lonely. Naomi had believed him completely. The memory of those words lingered as she reached the subway entrance, the metal stairs leading down into the steady rhythm of trains and commuters. The familiar scent of the underground station surrounded her, and she hesitated at the top step. Part of her wondered if she should still go see him tonight, if she should walk into whatever celebration was happening behind those golden hotel doors and place the truth directly in his hands. But the image of that wedding invitation returned instantly, the elegant script announcing a future that clearly no longer included her. Naomi descended the stairs slowly, her footsteps echoing softly against the tiled walls. At the platform a train roared past, the rush of wind lifting the edges of her coat as if urging her forward. She stood there watching the blur of lights streak across the darkness and felt something shift quietly inside her. Not anger, not even sadness exactly. Something steadier, something that felt like the first small piece of resolve. The train doors opened with a soft mechanical chime, and people stepped forward without hesitation, each one carrying their own story into the night. Naomi joined them, taking a seat near the window as the car began to move beneath the city. Outside, Manhattan continued glowing above the streets, unaware that the woman traveling quietly beneath it carried a secret that would one day reshape far more than a single broken promise. Naomi rested her hand gently against her stomach once more and whispered words no one else could hear. You and I will be all right. And somewhere deep in the rhythm of the moving train, for the first time since reading that invitation, she believed it. Morning arrived quietly over Manhattan, the pale light of dawn spreading across the skyline, as if nothing unusual had happened the night before. Naomi Carter woke before her alarm, her small apartment in Brooklyn still wrapped in the calm silence that only existed in the earliest hours of the day. For several seconds she remained still, staring at the ceiling as memories from the previous night slowly returned like waves against the shore. The invitation, the golden letters, the realization that the future she had imagined no longer existed. She inhaled deeply and sat up, her hand instinctively resting against her stomach. The apartment was modest but warm, the kind of place that felt honest rather than impressive. A narrow kitchen connected to a small living room where sunlight now touched the edge of a wooden table scattered with design sketches. Naomi had worked hard for every inch of this space long before Ethan Whitmore ever entered her life. Back then she had been a young interior designer building a reputation one small project at a time, staying up late to finish concepts for clients who often did not believe someone. Her age could transform their homes into something extraordinary. That determination had been part of what first attracted Ethan to her. He once said she had the rare ability to see possibility where other people only saw empty rooms. Naomi slipped out of bed and walked slowly to the window, pushing the curtain aside. The Brooklyn Bridge stretched across the East River in the distance, its steel cables glowing softly under the rising sun. New York looked peaceful from here, almost gentle. It was difficult to believe that somewhere across the water a wedding was being planned that would soon become the talk of every business magazine in the country. Ethan Whitmore had always lived in a world where decisions were announced with headlines and champagne. Naomi had lived in a quieter one, where victories were measured in long nights of work and the satisfaction of turning a client's house into a home. She moved into the kitchen and filled a kettle with water, the simple routine helping her steady her thoughts. As the stove warmed the metal, she allowed herself to remember the moment everything had first begun to change. It had been late summer, just 2 months earlier, when Ethan started traveling more frequently. At first he explained that a new European expansion required his attention, something about partnerships in London and Paris that could reshape the future of his company. Naomi had believed him easily. Success had always demanded long hours from him, and she admired the intensity he brought to his work. Yet small details soon began to shift in ways that felt impossible to ignore. Calls that ended quickly when she entered the room. Flights that appeared on his calendar without explanation. And once, late one evening, the name Victoria Langford flashing briefly across his phone screen before he turned it face down on the table. Naomi had asked about it then, her tone calm, her expression curious rather than suspicious. Ethan smiled in the easy way he often did when discussing business, and said Victoria was simply a strategic consultant helping with international negotiations. At the time, Naomi accepted the explanation. Trust, she believed, was the foundation of every meaningful relationship. Now, standing in the quiet light of morning, she understood how easily trust could become the thing that blinded you. The kettle whistled softly, pulling her back to the present. Naomi poured hot water into a mug and wrapped both hands around it, letting the warmth travel slowly through her fingers. Life had changed overnight, but the city outside her window had not paused to acknowledge it. Cars still moved along the bridge. People still hurried to early meetings. Somewhere, construction crews were already raising the skeleton of another skyscraper. The world continued forward. Naomi took a slow sip and felt the steady rhythm of her breathing return. Whatever Ethan Whitmore had chosen for his future, she realized that her own path no longer depended on it. And within the quiet certainty growing inside her, another life waited patiently for the moment when its story would finally begin. The morning after that quiet realization did not bring clarity, only questions that moved silently through Naomi Carter's mind as the hours passed. By mid-afternoon, the city had returned to its usual rhythm, taxis honking along busy avenues and office towers reflecting the pale autumn sun. Naomi sat at the small wooden table in her apartment, sketches spread around her like pieces of a puzzle she had not yet solved. A half-finished concept drawing rested beneath her hand, a living room design meant for a client in Soho who wanted something modern yet warm, something that would make guests feel welcome the moment they stepped inside. Naomi studied the lines carefully, adjusting the curve of a bookshelf and softening the angle of a window frame. Design had always been her way of bringing order to uncertainty. Rooms made sense in ways that life sometimes did not. You could rearrange space. You could introduce light where darkness once existed. But relationships were far more complicated than architecture. Her phone lay on the table beside the sketches, the screen dark but heavy with possibility. Ethan Whitmore had not called since the previous afternoon. At first she told herself he must still be traveling, perhaps finishing another meeting overseas. Yet the wedding invitation resting in a drawer only a few feet away made that explanation impossible to believe. Naomi leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes briefly, allowing a memory to rise without resistance. It had been early September when she and Ethan attended a dinner overlooking the Hudson River. The evening air had been warm, the sky streaked with orange and violet as the sun disappeared behind the skyline. Ethan had held her hand across the table and spoken about the future with a quiet confidence that made everything sound certain. He described a new international venture that would soon require him to spend several months abroad. At the time, Naomi had listened with curiosity rather than concern. She admired ambition. She understood that building something meaningful often required sacrifice. When she asked how long he might be gone, Ethan only smiled and said it would not matter because distance did not change what truly belonged together. Naomi had believed those words completely. Now she wondered whether he had already made his decision even then. The thought lingered as she stood and walked slowly across the apartment. Outside the window, the afternoon sunlight cast long reflections across the river, transforming the water into a moving mirror of silver and gold. Naomi placed one hand against the glass, feeling the faint coolness beneath her fingertips. 8 weeks pregnant. The truth still felt fragile, like something sacred that required quiet protection until the right moment arrived. She had planned to tell Ethan that very evening after dinner, imagining how his expression might change when he realized their lives were about to expand in ways neither of them had experienced before. Instead, the only message she received from him that day had been a short text earlier in the afternoon. Flight delayed. Meetings running late. We will talk soon. Naomi read the words again now, noticing how simple they appeared on the screen. No warmth. No explanation. Just a promise that conversation would happen later. She placed the phone down carefully and returned to the table, sliding the unfinished design sketch toward her. Work had always grounded her, reminding her that even when emotions felt uncertain, there were still things she could create with her own hands. She picked up a pencil and began adjusting the drawing once more, adding soft lighting above the shelves and a wider window frame to allow natural sunlight to fill the room. Slowly the design started to take shape again. Outside, clouds drifted across the sky, their shadows moving quietly over the water. Naomi focused on each careful line, unaware that somewhere across the city Ethan Whitmore was making preparations that would soon reveal just how dramatically their lives were about to change. Evening settled slowly over the city, the sky fading from pale blue into deep shades of amber as Naomi Carter continued working at the small wooden table near her window. The quiet scratch of her pencil across paper filled the apartment, steady and deliberate, the kind of sound that helped her think. Outside, the lights of Brooklyn began turning on one by one, reflecting softly across the East River like scattered stars. Hours had passed since the message from Ethan Whitmore appeared on her phone, and yet the promised conversation had not happened. Naomi glanced at the screen again. Still nothing. The silence felt different now, heavier, as if the distance between them had quietly expanded without either of them acknowledging it. She set the pencil down and stretched her fingers, feeling a faint tension in her shoulders from sitting too long. On the table, the nearly completed design sketch now looked balanced and inviting. The room she imagined filled with warm light and open space. It was the kind of environment people stepped into and immediately felt safe. Naomi believed deeply that spaces could influence emotions. A well-designed room could make someone feel calm even during the most uncertain moments of life. Yet the apartment around her felt strangely unfamiliar tonight, as though she were standing at the edge of a chapter that had already begun to close. Her phone vibrated suddenly against the wooden surface, the soft sound echoing in the quiet room. Naomi reached for it quickly, her heart lifting for a brief moment when Ethan's name appeared on the screen. But the message was not what she expected. Naomi, I am sorry for the short notice. Something important has come up. I will be leaving for Paris tomorrow morning. The words felt oddly formal, as if they had been written by someone she barely knew. Naomi read them again slowly, her eyes pausing on the final line that followed. We will talk when I return. Naomi remained still for several seconds, her mind trying to place those sentences into the life she believed she was living. Tomorrow morning. Paris. No explanation. No question about whether she might want to see him before he left. Outside the window, a passing train rattled faintly across the distant tracks, the vibration traveling softly through the glass. Naomi placed her hand against her stomach once more, the quiet gesture grounding her in a reality Ethan clearly did not yet understand. She had imagined telling him tonight, perhaps during dinner, perhaps during one of their long conversations where the world seemed to pause around them. Instead, he was leaving the country without even asking to see her. Naomi typed a reply slowly, choosing her words with the same careful precision she used when sketching a new design. When will you return? The response came almost immediately. I do not know yet. It may be several months, depending on how negotiations progress. Naomi stared at the screen, feeling a strange calm settle over her thoughts. Several months. By then, everything would be different. The truth growing quietly within her would no longer be something hidden or uncertain. She imagined the moment Ethan would eventually return to New York, stepping out of a black car in front of one of the glass towers where his company operated. He would likely expect everything to look the same. The same city, the same people, the same woman waiting in the life he left behind. Naomi exhaled slowly and turned her phone face down on the table. The room around her felt quiet, but no longer fragile. Outside, the skyline glowed with thousands of lights stretching toward the night sky, each window holding a different story unfolding behind it. Naomi picked up her pencil again and returned to the design sketch in front of her. For the first time since opening that invitation the night before, she understood something clearly. Ethan Whitmore was leaving New York believing he was simply traveling across the ocean. What he did not realize was that the moment his plane lifted into the sky, the life he once shared with Naomi Carter would begin moving forward without him. The next morning arrived with a quiet gray sky stretched across New York City, the kind of soft light that made the buildings look almost gentle despite their towering steel and glass. Naomi Carter woke before sunrise, her small Brooklyn apartment still wrapped in silence except for the distant hum of early traffic crossing the bridge. For several seconds, she lay still beneath the blanket, listening to the quiet rhythm of the world beginning another day. Somewhere across the Atlantic Ocean, Ethan Whitmore's plane would already be cutting through the clouds, carrying him toward a future he had chosen without explanation. Naomi did not check her phone when she opened her eyes. She already knew there would be no new message waiting there. Instead, she sat up slowly and placed her feet on the floor, breathing in the calm stillness of the room. The events of the previous night no longer felt sharp or overwhelming. They felt distant, almost like the final scene of a movie she had finished watching. The truth remained exactly the same. Ethan had left, and Naomi Carter was now responsible for a life that had quietly begun growing within her. She walked toward the kitchen and opened the window slightly, letting the cool morning air drift inside. The scent of the river carried through the streets, mixing with the faint aroma of coffee from a cafe 2 blocks away that had just opened its doors for the day. Naomi rested her hands against the edge of the counter and looked out toward the skyline. From this angle, Manhattan seemed both close and impossibly far away, the tall buildings glowing softly beneath the rising sun. Somewhere within those towers were boardrooms, investors, and the world Ethan Whitmore understood so well. Yet Naomi realized that her future no longer depended on any of them. She prepared a simple breakfast, moving slowly and deliberately, as if every action helped her settle into the new direction her life had taken. The kettle warmed on the stove while she sliced fruit and placed it carefully onto a plate. Small routines had always brought her comfort. They reminded her that stability could exist even when larger plans changed. As she sat down at the wooden table, her eyes drifted to the drawer where the wedding invitation remained hidden. For a moment she considered throwing it away. Instead, she left it where it was. Some things did not need to be erased. They simply needed to be understood. Naomi picked up a notebook and began writing quietly, outlining a list of design projects she planned to complete over the coming weeks. Her work had always been more than a career. It was the language through which she shaped the world around her. Each project represented possibility. A living room redesigned, a family space transformed, a quiet corner filled with light where someone could sit and breathe. As the morning progressed, sunlight moved slowly across the apartment floor, warming the wooden boards beneath her chair. Naomi paused and placed one hand gently over her stomach again. The gesture felt natural now, a silent promise. She made without speaking aloud. She did not know exactly what the coming months would bring. There would be challenges. There would be long days of work and moments when the path ahead felt uncertain. But she also knew something else with absolute clarity. The life growing within her deserved a future built on strength rather than disappointment. Outside, the city grew louder as the day fully began. Delivery trucks rolled through the streets. Pedestrians hurried toward subway entrances. Construction cranes lifted steel beams high above the skyline. New York was a city that never paused for long, and Naomi Carter realized she would not pause either. Across the ocean, Ethan Whitmore believed he had simply stepped onto another plane, another project, another chapter of ambition. But what he did not yet understand was that while he traveled thousands of miles away, the quiet morning unfolding inside a small Brooklyn apartment had already begun creating a future he could not imagine. Autumn deepened quietly across New York as the weeks passed, the leaves in Brooklyn's small neighborhood parks turning shades of amber and copper, while Naomi Carter adjusted to a life she had never planned but now accepted with calm determination. Each morning began earlier than the last. She would wake before the city fully stirred, make a simple breakfast, and spend the quiet hours sketching new design concepts before heading to client meetings across Manhattan. The subway rides had become part of her routine, the gentle sway of the train beneath the streets giving her time to think about the future she was building step by step. At 12 weeks, the pregnancy was no longer just a secret in her thoughts. The doctor confirmed that everything was progressing well, and Naomi left the clinic with a sense of responsibility that felt both heavy and meaningful. She walked through a nearby park afterward, the cool breeze brushing softly against her coat as she paused to watch parents pushing strollers along the pathways. A few months earlier, she might have simply admired the peaceful scene. Now she studied it with a new awareness, noticing the patience in the way a father adjusted a blanket around a sleeping baby or the quiet pride in a mother's smile as her toddler took uncertain steps. Life had always moved forward in small moments like these, Naomi realized. Not in the grand announcements that filled magazines and business headlines, but in the steady rhythm of everyday care. Work continued to fill her days, sometimes leaving her so focused that hours passed without her noticing the sunlight shifting across the office windows. Her small design studio had begun attracting more attention recently, particularly after one of her residential projects was featured in a regional architecture publication. Clients appreciated the warmth she brought into spaces, the way she balanced elegance with comfort. Naomi believed homes should feel alive rather than perfect. People deserved rooms that welcomed them after long days, places where laughter could echo without restraint. Late one afternoon, she returned to her apartment carrying a folder of updated plans for a renovation project in Tribeca. The hallway lights flickered softly as she climbed the stairs, the familiar creak of the wooden steps greeting her like an old friend. Inside the apartment, the air was warm and quiet, sunlight resting gently on the wooden table where she had worked so many evenings before. Naomi placed the folder down and removed her coat, moving slowly now as her body adjusted to the steady changes of pregnancy. She had begun keeping a small calendar on the refrigerator, marking each week with careful handwriting. 14 weeks. 15 weeks. The simple act of tracking time reminded her that the life growing within her was no longer just a future idea. It was real. One evening, while organizing her sketches, she noticed the wedding invitation again tucked inside the drawer beneath the table. For several seconds, she held it between her fingers, the gold lettering still as polished as the night it arrived. Ethan Whitmore and Victoria Langford. The words no longer felt sharp. They felt distant, like a story that belonged to someone she used to know. Naomi closed the drawer gently and returned to her work. Outside the window, the skyline of Manhattan glowed beneath the fading sunset, the glass towers reflecting colors that shifted from orange to deep violet. Across the ocean, Ethan Whitmore continued building whatever life he believed waited for him abroad, unaware that with every passing week the quiet apartment in Brooklyn was becoming the beginning of a story far more important than anything he had left behind. Winter arrived quietly but firmly in New York City, covering the streets with a thin layer of frost that sparkled beneath the early morning lights. Naomi Carter stood near the window of her Brooklyn apartment, her hands wrapped around a warm mug as she watched the first snow of the season drift slowly across the skyline. The city looked softer when snow fell, as if even the busiest streets were given permission to breathe for a moment. Nearly 6 months had passed since the evening she first opened that wedding invitation, and time had reshaped her life in ways she could never have predicted. Her reflection in the glass window revealed subtle but undeniable changes. Her posture carried a quiet strength, and the gentle curve beneath her coat told a story that was no longer hidden. The pregnancy had moved into its 7th month, and with each passing week Naomi felt the growing presence of the child who would soon enter the world. The doctor visits had become familiar rituals now, moments where she listened carefully as the steady heartbeat filled the examination room. Each sound reassured her that the future she was building was real and strong. Naomi set the mug down and moved slowly across the apartment, adjusting a stack of design plans on the wooden table. Her work had expanded steadily during the past few months. Word of her talent continued spreading through the design community, and clients now reached out from neighborhoods across Manhattan and even from neighboring states. A recent renovation project in Tribeca had attracted particular attention after photographs of the finished space appeared in a national architecture magazine. The article praised her ability to combine elegance with warmth, noting that Naomi Carter created environments that felt both sophisticated and deeply human. She had smiled when she read those words, recognizing that the same balance she sought in her designs was now shaping her own life. Outside, snow continued drifting through the air while the city moved forward with its usual determination. Taxi headlights reflected off the wet pavement, and pedestrians wrapped in heavy coats hurried towards subway entrances and coffee shops. Naomi slipped on her boots and coat, preparing for a client meeting scheduled later that morning. Moving through the apartment required a bit more care now, but she welcomed the slower rhythm. It reminded her to pay attention to the small details that often passed unnoticed during busier seasons of life. Before leaving, she paused beside the refrigerator where the calendar still hung, its pages marked with the passing weeks of pregnancy. 30 weeks. The number felt both astonishing and grounding. Soon the quiet apartment would no longer belong to just one person. The thought filled Naomi with a calm anticipation that replaced any lingering sadness from the past. She stepped outside into the crisp winter air and began walking toward the subway station, her breath forming soft clouds that faded quickly into the cold. Snowflakes rested briefly on her coat before disappearing, and the sounds of the city blended into a gentle background rhythm. Somewhere across the ocean, Ethan Whitmore continued his life in another world of boardrooms and international meetings, likely unaware that the woman he once left behind was now preparing to welcome a new chapter far more meaningful than anything he had pursued abroad. Naomi descended the subway stairs and joined the steady flow of commuters, her movements calm and confident. The train would arrive soon, carrying her toward another day of work, responsibility, and quiet progress. And with every passing moment, the life growing within her moved closer to becoming the greatest design she would ever create. The night the snowstorm arrived, New York City seemed to slow down just enough for Naomi Carter to notice how much her world had already changed. Heavy flakes drifted through the cold air outside her apartment window, covering the rooftops of Brooklyn in a soft white blanket that reflected the glow of the streetlights below. Naomi sat quietly on the small couch near the window, a folded blanket resting over her knees while the gentle hum of a heater filled the room with warmth. At 34 weeks pregnant, every movement now carried a new weight and awareness, yet there was also a deep calm that settled over her life in a way she had never experienced before. The apartment had gradually transformed during the past few weeks. A small crib now stood near the bedroom wall, its simple wooden frame carefully assembled by Naomi one quiet Sunday afternoon. A basket filled with tiny blankets rested beside it, along with neatly folded clothes no bigger than her hand. Preparing these things had been an emotional experience, not because of sadness, but because each small item represented a future she was ready to welcome. Naomi placed one hand gently over her stomach, feeling a subtle movement from within. The child had begun responding to the world more often. Now, sometimes shifting when music played softly in the background or when Naomi spoke while reviewing design plans at the table. She had started talking aloud during those moments, describing the city outside the window or the colors she imagined for her next project. It felt natural, as if the conversation had already begun long before the child would ever understand the words. The wind pushed softly against the glass as the storm grew stronger, and Naomi rose carefully from the couch before walking into the kitchen. She filled a kettle with water and placed it on the stove, the quiet routine once again grounding her thoughts. Over the past months, her work had continued expanding in ways that surprised even her. Several clients now trusted her with entire building renovations, and her design studio had officially registered as a growing business with projects scheduled well into the coming year. The success did not feel dramatic or sudden. It felt steady, built through countless hours of dedication and quiet determination. Outside, a snowplow moved slowly down the street, clearing a path for the cars that would eventually pass through the neighborhood in the morning. Naomi leaned slightly against the counter while waiting for the kettle to warm, her thoughts drifting briefly toward the past. It had been many months since she last heard from Ethan Whitmore. Not a message, not a phone call. The silence that once felt confusing had long since become irrelevant. Naomi realized that her life had filled with new meaning, responsibilities, and possibilities that no longer required his presence or explanation. The kettle whistled softly, and Naomi poured warm tea into a mug before returning to the couch. She wrapped both hands around the cup, feeling the warmth spread through her fingers as she watched the snowfall continue beyond the glass. The city looked peaceful under the storm, almost quiet enough to imagine that somewhere beyond the skyline a new chapter was waiting patiently to begin. Naomi took a slow sip of tea and smiled gently to herself. Soon the apartment would no longer echo with silence. Soon the small crib beside the bedroom wall would hold the child whose heartbeat she had listened to so many times in the doctor's office. And when that moment arrived, Naomi Carter knew with complete certainty that the life she had rebuilt from quiet determination would become the strongest foundation any child could ever call home. The storm finally passed sometime before dawn, leaving New York City wrapped in a quiet blanket of white that softened the edges of every building and street corner. Naomi Carter woke slowly as pale winter sunlight filtered through the curtains of her Brooklyn apartment, the room glowing with a calm stillness that felt different from any morning before. For a moment she remained still, listening to the distant sounds of the city beginning another day, but something inside her body told her this morning would not be ordinary. The realization came gradually, like the gentle shift of a tide. Naomi placed one hand against her stomach and felt a quiet wave of awareness move through her. The child she had carried for so many months was ready to arrive. Outside the window, snow covered the rooftops and sidewalks in soft layers that reflected the golden light of sunrise. The city looked peaceful, almost as if it had paused to witness the beginning of a new life. Naomi moved carefully from the bed, breathing slowly as she wrapped a warm robe around herself and walked toward the kitchen. The small apartment that had once felt like a place of solitude now felt like a sanctuary preparing to welcome something extraordinary. The tiny crib beside the bedroom wall waited patiently, the folded blankets inside it untouched but ready. Naomi paused beside it for a moment, her fingers brushing lightly against the smooth wooden rail. She had imagined this day many times during the past months, but the reality carried a deeper meaning than she could have predicted. This child was more than a new beginning. It was a quiet promise that life could grow even from moments of uncertainty and loss. She reached for her phone on the kitchen counter and called the car service she had arranged weeks earlier, her voice calm and steady as she explained that she needed transportation to the hospital. Within minutes the confirmation arrived. The driver would be outside in 15 minutes. Naomi gathered the small hospital bag she had prepared and slipped on her coat, pausing once more before leaving the apartment. The room looked warm and welcoming, sunlight touching the wooden table where so many late-night sketches had taken shape. Every corner of the space held memories of the months she had spent building a future. With patience and determination, stepping outside into the cold winter air felt almost symbolic, as if she were walking through the doorway between two chapters of her life. Snow crunched softly beneath her boots as she moved down the steps toward the waiting car. The driver greeted her politely and opened the door, the interior already warmed against the winter chill. As the vehicle began moving through the quiet Brooklyn streets, Naomi watched the city glide past the window. Snow covered the trees in the nearby park, their branches bending gently under the weight of ice crystals that sparkled in the morning light. The world looked calm and beautiful, a contrast to the powerful moment unfolding within her life. At the hospital entrance, nurses greeted her with practiced warmth, guiding her through the bright corridors where the sounds of monitors and distant footsteps blended into a steady rhythm of care and anticipation. Hours passed slowly but steadily as the medical team supported her through each stage of the process. Naomi focused on breathing and the quiet encouragement of the nurses who reminded her that everything was progressing exactly as it should. And then, as afternoon sunlight began shining through the tall windows of the maternity floor, the moment finally arrived. The sound that filled the room was small yet powerful, a newborn cry that carried more meaning than words could ever express. Naomi felt tears gather in her eyes as the nurse gently placed the baby in her arms. The child's tiny fingers curled instinctively around her hand, and for the first time since this long journey had begun, Naomi understood the true shape of the life she had created. Outside the hospital windows, the city continued its endless movement. unaware that within one quiet room a new story had just taken its first breath. Morning light filled the hospital room with a quiet glow as Naomi Carter sat beside the window, holding the small bundle wrapped carefully in a soft white blanket. Outside, the snow that had fallen the night before reflected the rising sun, turning the city skyline into a field of pale gold and silver. The sounds of the maternity floor moved gently through the hallway beyond the door, nurses speaking softly, footsteps echoing faintly against polished floors, and somewhere in the distance the quiet cry of another newborn beginning their first day in the world. Naomi looked down at the tiny face resting peacefully in her arms, still amazed by how something so small could carry so much meaning. The nurse had told her earlier that the baby was strong and healthy, a perfect start to a life that had already overcome so many unseen challenges. Naomi brushed her finger gently across the baby's tiny hand, smiling as the little fingers curled instinctively around her touch. In that moment, every long month, every quiet evening, and every uncertain step that brought her here suddenly felt purposeful. The past had not disappeared, but it no longer held power over the life unfolding in front of her. A gentle knock sounded at the door before a nurse stepped inside, her warm smile carrying the calm confidence of someone who had witnessed many beginnings just like this one. She checked the monitors briefly and adjusted the blanket around the baby before turning back toward Naomi. "Everything looks wonderful," she said softly, her voice carrying reassurance that settled easily in the quiet room. Naomi thanked her with a grateful smile, feeling the deep relief that came from hearing those simple words. After the nurse left, Naomi turned slightly toward the window again. The city stretched far beyond the hospital walls, thousands of lives continuing their daily rhythm beneath the winter sky. Somewhere offices were opening, taxis were filling the avenues, and people hurried along sidewalks carrying plans and responsibilities into the new day. Yet inside this small room the world felt wonderfully still. Naomi leaned back against the pillow and allowed herself a moment of reflection. Nearly a year had passed since the night she first held that invitation in her hands. The night when the future she once imagined seemed to disappear without explanation. At the time she could not have predicted how her life would unfold. She could not have imagined the quiet strength she would discover within herself or the new purpose that would reshape every part of her world. Now, holding her child for the first time, Naomi realized that life rarely followed the paths people expected. Sometimes the moments that felt like endings were simply turning points guiding someone towards something greater. The baby stirred slightly, letting out a soft sound before settling again, and Naomi adjusted the blanket carefully. She studied the small features with gentle curiosity, noticing the calm rhythm of each breath, and the peaceful expression that seemed almost thoughtful despite the child's first hours in the world. In the coming years there would be many questions to answer and many stories to tell, but for now none of that felt urgent. The only thing that mattered was the quiet connection between mother and child as they began this new chapter together. Outside the hospital window, the snow slowly melted beneath the growing warmth of sunlight, revealing the busy streets of New York returning to life once again. Naomi Carter watched the city move forward and felt something deep and steady settle within her heart. The journey that once began with uncertainty had now led her to the most meaningful role she would ever hold. And as the small life in her arms continued sleeping peacefully, Naomi understood with absolute clarity that the future ahead was no longer defined by the choices someone else had made long ago. It belonged entirely to the family she had just begun. The hospital discharged Naomi Carter 2 days later, and the winter air outside felt sharper, but somehow brighter as she stepped carefully through the entrance holding the small carrier that now contained the most important person in her world. Snow still lined the sidewalks in quiet white ridges, though the streets had already been cleared by the steady rhythm of the city returning to motion. A pale sun reflected against the tall buildings of Manhattan across the river, and Naomi paused for a moment beside the car waiting to take her home. The driver opened the door politely, but Naomi remained still long enough to look down at the tiny face resting peacefully beneath the soft blanket. The baby slept calmly, unaware of the enormous city surrounding them or the quiet journey that had brought them to this moment. Naomi smiled gently before stepping inside the car, settling carefully into the seat while the driver closed the door and guided the vehicle into the slow midday traffic. The ride across the bridge felt different now than it had months earlier. Back then she had often stared toward the skyline with uncertainty, wondering how the future would unfold after Ethan Whitmore disappeared from her life without explanation. Today the same skyline looked almost welcoming, the steel towers reflecting winter sunlight like thousands of mirrors stretching into the sky. Naomi watched the city quietly through the window while the car moved across the East River, the gentle motion of the road rocking the baby into a deeper sleep. When they reached Brooklyn, the familiar streets appeared exactly as she remembered them. The corner bakery with its warm smell of fresh bread, the small park where children would soon return once the snow melted, and the brick building that held the apartment she had turned into a place of comfort and determination during the past year. The driver helped carry her bag upstairs, offering a respectful smile, before leaving Naomi alone with the quiet warmth of her home. For a moment she simply stood inside the doorway, listening to the silence that once felt heavy but now felt peaceful. She carried the baby into the bedroom and placed the carrier gently beside the crib that had waited patiently for this day. The afternoon light filtered softly through the curtains, touching the wooden furniture and the small blankets she had folded weeks earlier. Naomi lifted the baby carefully and settled into the chair beside the window, holding the child close as the quiet rhythm of breathing filled the room. Time seemed to move differently in moments like this. Minutes passed without urgency, while Naomi studied the tiny details of the new life she had brought into the world. The child's small fingers curled gently against the blanket, and each slow breath carried a calm presence that filled the room more completely than any conversation ever could. Naomi felt a deep sense of gratitude rising quietly within her, not for the path she once expected, but for the strength she discovered along the way. The months of uncertainty, the quiet determination, the nights spent planning a future that no longer included the past had all led to this peaceful afternoon in a sunlit Brooklyn apartment. She glanced briefly toward the wooden table in the living room where design sketches still rested in careful stacks, reminders of the work that had helped her rebuild a life one project at a time. Those plans would continue, and her business would grow, but now every decision carried a deeper purpose. The future she was building was no longer only her own. Outside the window, the sounds of the neighborhood returned gradually, a passing car, distant laughter, and the quiet footsteps of someone walking through the snow along the sidewalk. Life continued exactly as it always had, yet for Naomi Carter everything had changed. She looked down once more at the peaceful child in her arms and felt the certainty that the story she was living now was far stronger than anything that had ended before. And somewhere far across the ocean, in a world of distant boardrooms and business headlines, Ethan Whitmore still had no idea that the most meaningful chapter of his life had already begun without him. Spring arrived quietly in Brooklyn several months later, bringing soft sunlight and the gentle sound of birds returning to the small trees that lined Naomi Carter's street. The long winter had slowly faded, and with it the final traces of the uncertainty that once filled her life. Inside the apartment, morning light moved across the wooden floor and rested gently beside the crib near the window. Naomi stood nearby holding her son, now several months old, his curious eyes open wide as he studied the bright world around him. The quiet room that once echoed with silence had transformed into a place filled with small joyful sounds, the soft cooing of a baby, the gentle rhythm of a rocking chair, and the calm voice of a mother learning the language of care one day at a time. Naomi smiled as the child reached toward the sunlight streaming through the window, his tiny hand opening and closing with fascinated determination. She carried him toward the kitchen where a pot of oatmeal warmed slowly on the stove, the comforting scent filling the apartment just as the first sounds of the neighborhood waking drifted through the open window. Life had developed its own rhythm now, one built on patience, love, and quiet perseverance. Naomi balanced work and motherhood with the same thoughtful attention she once brought to every design project. Her business continued growing steadily, and several recent projects had attracted national recognition. Articles in architecture magazines praised her ability to create spaces that felt alive, environments where families could build memories and find comfort in the everyday moments of life. Yet the greatest achievement Naomi recognized each morning was far simpler. It was the peaceful presence of the child now resting against her shoulder, the steady reminder that even unexpected beginnings could lead to extraordinary futures. She placed the baby gently into the high chair beside the table and continued preparing breakfast while sunlight filled the apartment. Outside, the neighborhood park had begun to bloom with early spring flowers, and children's laughter echoed faintly across the street as families returned to the playground after months of winter cold. Naomi watched the scene for a moment through the window, feeling a deep sense of calm settle over her heart. The city she once viewed with uncertainty now felt like a place full of opportunity and quiet promise. Months earlier, she had wondered how life could move forward after everything changed so suddenly. Now she understood that the future did not require perfect plans or predictable paths. Sometimes the most meaningful journeys began when someone chose to keep moving forward despite uncertainty. Naomi carried her son back toward the window and held him close, pointing gently toward the skyline rising across the river. The towers of Manhattan glowed beneath the bright spring sky, the same city that once witnessed the moment her life seemed to shift without warning. Yet standing here now, she realized that the ending she once feared had simply opened the door to a stronger beginning. Far away across the ocean, Ethan Whitmore continued living in the world he had chosen long ago, unaware that the quiet life he left behind had grown into something far more meaningful than he ever imagined. Naomi Carter no longer wondered whether he would return or what explanations he might offer one day. The answers no longer mattered. The future she held in her arms had already given her everything she needed. And as the morning sunlight filled the room and her son's laughter echoed softly against the walls, Naomi understood that the life she built from courage and quiet determination had become the most beautiful design she would ever create.